All right. Hello, one audience member. Let's talk about testing SQL queries. So what I wanted to cover was writing a Node app that uses Postgres. And then I want to cover writing tests for that for these queries. Cool. So I've created a schema here that is got users and posts, and so this is meant to be like a blog with multiple users and multiple blog posts. And I've added a few users, and then I'm also going to insert some blog posts. I want to see if this code works though. So I am going to, what? Why are you doing that? What is happening? All right, that was weird. Cool, so I'm gonna make a database. We'll call it create DB. We'll call it testing SQL queries. Cool. So I'm gonna use this technique here to try to load. Oh, I have a trailing comma here, and these can't have trailing commas either. Maybe this can't have a trailing comma. There we go. Okay. We also have to drop table if posts exist. There we go. Cool. So this insert's working. So let's also do an insert into posts for user ID, title, body, and user ID will be select ID from users where email is equal to me. And that'll be the user ID, and the title will be like Jared's first blog post, and the body will be like, oh my god, I have a new blog. So let's see, we'll insert 2 of these and see if we can get this to work.
You know, technically they can't do that. That's like a stall.
Okay, so if we run this again, oh, I think we need a comma after these. Oh, and then we gotta get rid of that. Yes. This is the lecture.
Yeah, I always want to come. I get so caught up in my work that I forget it's happening.
Oh no.
Yeah, I just randomly saw your message about the game.
I think these need to all be single quotes. Escape that. Oh my god. Alright. No apostrophes. There we go. Okay, so let's open Postico and let's see if we have the database we expect. What did we call it? Testing SQL queries. Oh man, I have so many of these already. Okay, cool. So we have users that have me and Justin and Bonnie, and then we have posts, one for me and one for Bonnie. Let's add a second one for me. I feel like they try to do the same. Great. All right. So we've got this little bit of database schema set up with some records in it. Now let's write a node script that is going to to do some queries against this data set. So we've got this database folder, and here's the client where we're going to require Postgres. We're going to connect to this new database we just created, and then we're going to export this connected client object that's connected to Postgres. So this is what's going to be in our database client file, which will get access to our client connection. So then inside of queries, we're going to write a query in here, and we're requiring this PG object from the client directory so we have access to an object that can make SQL queries. And then we're going to export functions that do those queries. So the very first one will be just get all users. How about we just say get user by email? Let's do that first. So we're going to need to take the content for the query and then a callback for when the query completes. So we'll do select star from users where email equals, and I forget how you do this with Postgres, so node PG. I'm just looking up the node PG docs because I don't know exactly how to insert email into here safely. Here it is. You do like $1 and then the second argument is an array. Cool. So we'll just do email here. And so here's our query. Select star from users where email equals $1, and then $1 is our email that was given. And if there's an error, we're going to call the callback with an error. Otherwise, we're going to call the callback with whatever rows came back from our collection, from our query here. So get user by email should be usable like this. Get user by email, jared@learnersguild.org with a callback that takes an error and users. So this should be something like that. Yeah. That's how we're expecting folks to use this function. Does that all make sense so far? How we're connecting to Postgres and how we're going to see if this query works? So let's see if it works. Get user by email. I'm going to do rows bracket 0 because I think this is supposed to just be the user because it's singular, right? Get user by email. So we'll also tack on a limit 1 here. All right, so let's see if it works. We are going to test this manually by just running node and saying queries equals require /database query. I hope so. I'm in the meeting, I'm sharing my screen, and I am recording. So I think everything's set up. Are you not seeing it?
I don't have you, I just have you sign up.
Let's stop sharing, share screen. You might be in the wrong Zoom because... What's up?
You go up to where...
Oh, because I'm not sharing my face. Okay, sorry about that, folks. Here's the correct Zoom room to be in. Let me know if that doesn't work. All right, let's try this query. So we're loading up node, and we're going to require the local directory database /queries. Oh, and we need to npm install. I forgot about that. So if we look at our package JSON, I already installed PG, Chai, and Mocha as dependencies to this project. So then I just did npm install, so node modules should contain PG. So let's try this again. So we'll go into the node console, require the queries file, and you'll see that queries.getUser by email is a function we can call. So we'll try to get my user, and then we'll give a callback.
Nice. It just took a minute. Thank you for your help.
You didn't have a set timeout.
And we'll see
So,
what we got back just by console logging it.
did you see what we did?
And there we go. We got null as our error, and we got an anonymous object that has the information of my user from the database. If we were to pass in like Bonnie, we should get Bonnie back from the database, yeah. And then if we pass in a bad email address, we should just get back undefined. And then I think if we pass in like a weird object, no, we still get, I was trying to create an error here. A number, no. Okay, well anyway, if there was an error, we would have had been given us that. All right, so that is how this works. We can see that it works because we tested it manually in the console. Let's write a test for it. So here's my structure. I have a database with a client that connects and a queries file that does one query. So we want to write a test for that. So in my test directory, I've got test database queries-test. And we're going to write a test. So we're going to write get all users. Here we're requiring the queries file, and here we're saying describe the queries, describe the get all users, or excuse me, not get all users, describe the get user by email query. And here we'll say context when given a existing and valid email address. It should call the given callback with the single user record from the DB. And then another context, when given an invalid email address, it should call the given callback with undefined. So these are the two cases at which I expect my function to do one thing or the other, right? Question?
I've never seen context before.
Context is an alias for describe. It doesn't do anything other than just give you another nested block, just like describe does, but it has human context or human difference in how it's supposed to be used. Describe is to describe a thing, and context is to describe the state of the world, right? So when in existing, let me get back to how we're gonna run these tests here. I'm gonna want to talk about the setup of the test suite a little bit, but basically this context doesn't describe a thing, it describes like a state of the world when given a valid email address, right? So in the before each block here, I'm actually going to put a function that's going to set up the world like this, versus a different before each block down here that's going to set up the world to be like this. So what do I mean by setting up the world? Well, in your test environment, when you're testing when you're testing something that involves a database, the database is a giant state. Is a giant object or repository for the state of your application, right? It says what users exist, what blog posts exist, right? It's a giant thing of state. So when we're testing functionality, we need to have control over state so that we can set up the state of the world so we know that functions will do what we want them to do given certain state of the world, right? So this function that we just wrote here, is going to do something different depending on whether or not depending on what's in the database, right? So if there are no users in the database, this thing's always going to call the callback with null, or excuse me, with undefined. But if the user does exist in the database, it's going to call you with that record, right? So since we have two different ways this function could execute depending on what's in the database, in our test, we're actually going to modify the database here. by injecting a user with the matching email address. And then down here, we're actually going to do nothing because the database is already empty at the beginning of each test. So it doesn't matter what email address we pass in. We're going to get back undefined because we're going to decide what's in the database before we call code that's going to talk to the database.
So with a before each, you can put it either before all the it statements or before all the describe statements. Like if you put it out right under queries, it would run it anytime before any describe, right? Like I'm just
the placement of the question is about the placement of before each, and before each only refers to the its that are defined in this callback or below. So this before each will only be for this it, and this before each will only be for this it. If I had several its, it'd be for all these its. But if I had another it out here, it would not be for this it. This before each is inside of these contexts. If I took this and put it up here, then it would work for this one and this one and this one, right? Because it's always just below it, basically. And the order doesn't matter. If I put it here, it's still going to run before that it. As far as I know. I've never done that, but I'm pretty sure that's how that works. But anyway, I would play with it and put some console logs and get a feel for how before each works. Cool. All right, so how are we going to do this? How are we going to empty our database every time our test suite starts? What I'm going to do is I'm going to say before each at the very top here, and I'm going to empty out our database. So in order to do that, I'm going to get my own reference to the PG object from the database client. I'm just calling this PG because it makes sense to me to call it Postgres. I could also call it like database client or something like that. And we're just going to run a query in here, which is going to be truncate users. Can you truncate more than one database at the same time? Let's find out. Let's see if we can get away with that. All right, so before every single test, we're just going to go empty our database. This is something I'm probably going to move here, but for now, I'm just showing you how it's done, right? You empty the database, and since this is asynchronous, we need to tell Mocha this is asynchronous and tell it when it's going to be done. And so we're going to just call done as soon as this callback comes back. And if there was an error, we'll pass the error to done, but generally there won't, hopefully there isn't an error, in which case we'll pass nothing because error will be null, right? So cool. So now all the two tables in our database should be empty before every single test in this file runs. That's step one, empty the database. And we want to empty the database because we want to know that we need a reset point, right? We need a consistent place to start testing, and this is the most consistent place, is just empty, right? So we start with emptying the database, and then down here we're going to say, let's do this test first because it actually doesn't require that we actually do anything. We're just going to say call the queries dot get user by email, and we'll just make this up, bob@bob.com, with a callback that takes an error and the user. And then we need to tell Mocha that this is an asynchronous test, so we'll do that by taking done here. And then we're gonna say expect, which I don't have my expectation library. I forgot about that. Let's get that. We want to get expect from chai.expect. Cool. So we're going to say expect error to be null. And we're also going to expect user to be undefined. All right, so let's check this out. Ignoring this one for now. Step 1, empty the database. Step 2, call get user by email with bob@bob.com, and then when this callback comes back, make sure that error is null and user is undefined, and then the test is done. If this callback doesn't get called, then the test will time out because done will never get called. Any questions about this one first test we wrote? Yep.
I'm a little confused by the invalid email, and you're going to get undefined.
Why is it invalid?
I'm sorry, maybe.
The email is invalid because the database is empty. There is no users in the database, so there can't be a user
Oh, I
for
thought you were putting the email in.
get user by email, yeah, which is this here, which is select star from users where email equals this limit 1. So let's run our test. Got an error on line 7. Before each. Thank you. Is there a before each here too? Okay, so this one passed just because there's nothing in it. So here I'll make it pending for now. And there we go. Should call the given callback with undefined. Yes.
Did you make that test pending again?
Just took the function out of it.
Oh, okay.
It with no function callback just is pending by default. By default. I think you could have also done it.x. I think pens it, but I can clearly wrong about that. But anyway, let's check this out. Okay, so then now we've just written a test where the test is now passing. And every time you write a test and the first time you get it to pass, you need to make sure that it's actually testing what it's testing. Because it's actually really easy. Just like this, right? Here's a passing test. Test nothing. It's worthless, right? So passing tests aren't helpful. Tests that break when they're supposed to are helpful. So we're going to go into our queries thing and we're going to break it. Step 1, do nothing in our function. This should cause the test to time out because the callback that we gave it never got called. Great, test fails. Reliability. Let's say, how else can we cause this thing to break? We could just call the callback with an error. Great, it failed when we got an error. That's what we like to see. Let's call it with no error and an object with some stuff in it. Should it fail? It fails because it expected that to be undefined. So I'm going in here and I'm testing the robustness of my test by messing up my code. And making sure that when my code is messed up, my test fails. Because that's the reliability that you're going for, is you want to know when something breaks. So you got to break it to see if your test will tell you that something is broken. Because if your test doesn't tell you when it breaks, your test is worthless, or at least for that kind of breakage. Make sense? Cool. All right. So let's create another one here. Oh no, wait, we still have one test. We need this test where we can say modify the DB by injecting a user. So we're going to use PG again here, and this is again asynchronous, so we have to take done. And we're going to say, how are we going to inject a user? What's the SQL for that? Anyone know?
Insert.
That's the first word, insert into
whatever the table is.
users. Anyone else knows the SQL here?
Put parentheses.
Values, parentheses,
The things you want to put in.
and the things I want to put in there. And SQL likes single quotes, so I'm going to use backticks here. Insert into users, and I'm just going to go copy what I did over here since I already wrote it. And so here, actually, normally what I'm just going to write the SQL here because it'll be easier to read. Okay, insert into users name and email values, bob@bob.com. Oh, that's the email, and then name is just Bob. Great. So this should insert. I guess I can make this on the same line. This will run this SQL, and then down here, we're going to basically do the same thing we're doing here, but it's going to be error is null and user to equal name Bob, email bob@bob.com, and ID, we actually don't know what the ID is going to be. So there's a couple of tricks here we can do. We can actually tell it what we want the ID to be. Is one trick, so let's do that one first. All right, so we inserted a user, and then we asked for it, and we expect to get back this object. Pretty specific test. Yes?
Is that you think you got a typo up there in the upper bob.com?
I do. Nice catch. Thank you. I love pairing with the crowd. Okay, SQL is not defined. Oh yeah, because I capitalized it. Done, not defined. I forgot to take done up in this test here. Okay, and what do we do when we write our first passing test?
Break it.
Break that shit. All right, so how do we break this thing? Anyone have any ideas how I can break this thing to make sure that this is doing what it's supposed to do?
Comment stuff out.
Yep. So we can always go into our implementation here and just comment the whole thing out, and we should see both of our tests should time out. Cool. Same stuff we did before, right? Call the callback with a new error. Fails our tests. What if we call it with null and that? Great. So expected empty object to equal this specific thing. So I trust that this is going to fail because my test is pretty specific. You'd have to come back with this exact object to pass. So I'm pretty confident this test is going to work. Going to tell me if my code breaks in the future. Cool. So let's look over this and see if we have any questions about the asynchronous nature of using these asynchronous before eaches, or any more questions about context or anything like that.
So if we're doing, let's say we're using promises, would you recommend us still using done in certain cases?
If you're using promises, Mocha will let you do both, right? So if you're like some func that returns a promise, right? So let's say we're doing something that returns a promise.
Yeah.
You can actually just return the promise to Mocha. So if you did like this, Mocha will pay attention to that promise if you return it. You can also just do something like .then done, and you have to do two dones because this is success and this is failure, but you could do it like that.
So wait a minute, the first done would be success, and the second done forever is just an error.
Catch any errors.
Wow.
This is the same as it's not exactly the same, but very similar to doing that.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, look up then for promises. It takes a success and failure function, but usually we just use chaining of catch. But this is the way, right? Just return the promise, right? And if you're doing that, you can actually do something cool like that if you want. But we need this. Yes, question in the back.
But in this case, there's no prompting. PG doesn't, by default, actually use promises, right? You have to use PG promise.
PG promise is the thing that wraps around PG and uses promises, yep.
Yeah. So in this case, if you wanted to use promises,
I'd have to use PG promise.
but like, let's say PG promise wasn't invented, you would go to your
Sure, I
query,
could.
you would put,
Yeah.
you would return a promise.
Yes, I could come in here, and this is a bit off topic, but I could make a promise.
Right? Wouldn't you return it?
Yes. You could come in
I could
here.
actually use promise in this context.
You could, yeah. You could come in here and instead of taking a callback, return a promise, and then instead of calling a callback, you call resolve or you call reject, and it's like that. So now this is wrapped around in a promise. But who wants to write new promise all day? And PG promise does exist, so we should just use that. But yeah, turning a function that takes a callback into a function that takes the same number of parameters and returns a promise is a pattern that happens, right? It's what PG promise is doing to PG, is wrapping around those callback functions. Yeah, that's the way you would do it. But let's get back to testing these functions here. Okay. So this is an example of get a user by email. And basically it's all the same from here. It just gets more complicated from this example, right? So step 1, empty the database. Step 2, set up the database in the way that you need it to be set up in order for you to be able to test what it is you're testing, right? We need a user to be in the database so that we can query for it. So we put one in there. We could, we could run this test with data in the database, but it doesn't matter either way. It's just I'm already emptying the database out for every test, so I'm just going to do nothing because I don't need a user in the database to look up a user that's not in the database, right? So I don't have a before each there. But if we start testing anything more complex, right? So this schema that we have here has users and posts, and you can get all the posts for a particular user, right? So we could, in our queries here, we could have get all posts for user. And then we could get all the posts for a given user ID. We could also get all the posts for a user email or something like that, right? Let's do it that way. So we're going to say, give me all the posts for a user's email. So it's basically going to be the same as this. But what's our query going to be? To get all the posts for a user with this given email. And if you want to look at the schema again, you can see it here.
Select all.
Select star, you mean?
I mean, not all, but select, was it, you said posts?
Select all the posts, so all the records from the post table.
Okay, so select posts from.
Select star from posts.
Where email, yeah, we're going by email equals yada, yada, yada.
Okay. Anyone think this is going to work?
Yeah, so you have a post table. Yeah, select.
So here's our post table. There's no email column in the post table.
Oh.
It's linked by user ID.
That means we have to link the user.
You say we're
You have to join.
We have to join, yes. What do we have to join on?
Join another
ID.
table. Where's the table? The user ID. That one. Join users
On.
on user ID equals email. User.id equals. Okay, wait. Users.id equals posts.
Dot
User ID.
user
Post
underscore
ID.
ID.
Correct. Cool. So yes, so we're going to join, and then we're going to say where email equals that. So instead of selecting star, we're going to select posts.star. just because otherwise we'll get the joined information and we don't want that.
Post.
I've never seen that.
What do you mean you've never seen it?
I feel like I've never seen it.
Post
Well-
dot star. That's what he's saying.
Here, I'll show you.
Like,
Check it out. Select star from posts, and we just do this join. Oh, I don't have any posts in my database, unfortunately. But here, check this out. If I select star, look at all these columns. ID, user ID, title, body, ID again, name, email, right? It's the join.
oh, you
So-
just want the posts.
Right, so post.star is just going to give you from the post table.
I just never seen dot star. Post.
Yeah, is there some other way to do that? What's the other way you can do that? Isn't there some other way?
Not that I'm aware of.
Oh.
Table.star gives you all the columns from that table. Cool. I think this will work. So here's my SQL. Here's my SQL, my email. All right, we called this get all posts for user email. Great. So queries tests. So we're going to come down here. And this is, we're going to make a new describe. And what do we have any, we think of any context, any way the world can be that we need to consider when testing this?
There needs to be posts.
Using context or using it?
Well, context is about the state of the world. It is about a behavior. So if the state of the world is irrelevant, it should always behave the same, then we'll just use its, and we'll just describe the behavior. But if the behavior changes based on the state of the world, like based on what's in our database, then we want to set up our state of the world, set up our database before we test the behavior that's contextually relevant to that state of the world. So we're giving email address as our first input, right? Here's where we'll start. What are we taking? Well, we have two different worlds that we can be in. When the email is valid, right? So there's at least two dimensions. That's one dimension, right, of where we could be. And then we also have like when there are posts and when there are no posts. That will get back a different response. Does that make sense? So we want to know, does our function work when these things are, depending on the state of the world, these states of the world, right? So the first one's easy. Context, when given an invalid email. We don't have to do anything for this one because all emails are invalid when the database is empty, right? So we're going to call queries.getAllPosts by email address, bob@bob.com, callback with an error, and posts. Okay, and then we want to expect that error is null, and we want to expect that posts is actually an empty array. And then we also need to make, oh, this is, I'm messing this up. This does not go in here. This goes in an it block. It should call the given callback with no error and an empty array of posts. There we go. All right. Is this test, any questions about this test? Anyone want to guess whether they think it'll work or not? Whether they think this test will pass or not? Should we try it? Let's try it. Expected undefined to deeply equal. So it looks like it's coming back with undefined. And I was expecting it to come back with a 0 array, right? Because if I do this query, I'm curious what this is. So I'm going to do a little debugging. All right, so the SQL we ran was select star from post, where user ID equals user ID, where email equals $1, which was bob@bob.com. So check out the fields in this object. And then rows as array, row as array false. I'm not sure what that means. But I don't even see like a rows. Oh, I do see rows. Oh, I'm sorry. I messed up and left this in here from the previous copy and paste of the old function where I was just getting the first one. Rows should always be an array. So here we go. Okay, it passes. Did my mistake make sense? I was passing back the first result, not all the results. And since it was an empty array, the first result was undefined. So there we go. We have one more test that says if I try to get all the posts for a user that doesn't exist, I'll get back an empty array. Maybe that's how we want it to work, maybe not. If we wanted to change it to see if this email address was valid and throw an error or something, we could do that, but this is how it works so far. So let's work on the next context. When given a valid email address. So how do I make an email address valid? I got to put something in the database. How do I do that?
For each.
Yep, we'll do a before each. That takes it done. And we will inject something in the database here. So we'll inject our friend Bob here again. And it's actually the same. It should give us back an empty array too. So I won't actually know whether or not this user is in the database or not if it's empty. But I'm going to put another nested context that's like these two contexts here, when there are some posts and when there are no posts. And we're going to do another before each here. And this before each is going to, oh, this one doesn't need one because there are no posts. Move the negative one up first. And then when there are some posts, we need to inject a post. So let's do our SQL injection here, and we're going to insert into posts. And we're going to pass in user ID and title and content, I think. Just title and button. I don't know what the, oh, I do. The user ID is 123, and this will be Bob's first post. And I love my new blog. All right, so we've inserted some posts into the table. So when there are no posts, it's going to be the same thing here. We're just going to say it should call the callback with no error and an empty array. So we may not need this context. But down here, this is where it gets different. It should call the given callback with no error and an array of 2 posts. And there we go. So I want to check that these posts are actually, that I want to be able to deep equal these things. I can't remember my key command. There we go. All right. So I want to be able to just say what the whole object should be like this, because it's just easier and it actually makes the test more brittle, which means it's more likely to fail if something goes wrong, but also means it's more likely to need to be changed when you change the way your code works, right? So if these records change, I have to come in here and change this test. But if they change, it also makes this test fail. So it's a trade-off of work I have to do in the future, but also reliability that this will fail if something changes. So we get to decide about that trade-off. But so here, ID 6 and ID 7, that's not going to stay the same. So I'm actually just going to manually assign some IDs here. And then we'll know what these IDs are. And we're deep equaling, sweet. So if you want to get a sense of that describe and context, right? Describe queries, describe get user by email. When an existing email is valid, it should do this. When the given email is, oh God, that was not right. Right, so this kind of reads as a spec, right? It reads, you know, a little bit of English form here, like how these functions should function in given context. So these are nice, clean tests, in my opinion. They test an asynchronous function that takes a callback. Now, this is, you could apply this technique that I'm showing you here and this structure to any functions that are asynchronous that take callbacks. You could also modify it to deal with promises as well. The fact that we're going into the database here is just one example of an asynchronous thing. Like we could be testing an HTTP API where we also need to like modify the database and then do an HTTP request and get back some expected data, right? So the asynchronous technique here is one thing to keep an eye on when you're looking over this and trying to understand this stuff, but also how we manage a database and how we empty out the database before every test. Like that's something specific about testing database queries, but there's also stuff here to know that's just general about asynchronous function testing.
Can you just talk a little bit about how you set up the PG client on this separate test? Like, had you already set up, you just required...
I just already had...
file that sets up the client.
Yeah, I set up my database folder to have a client, and then the queries file requires the client, and the commands file also requires the client. So all the client here is doing is just connecting to the database.
Okay, so that you're able to actually do queries today. How much time do you have left?
10 minutes.
I have a question. On the tests, from my reading about tests, like it seems like there's this process where some people, after each test, they destroy the data that they placed before. I was wondering if it's more something you have to do with like objects and whatnot, or is it like queries?
It's just a different approach, right? If every time I go into the database and make a change, I'm responsible for knowing what those changes are and undoing them properly. That is more error prone than every time we start a test, the very first thing we do is empty out the database, right? Because I can write a test that goes in and adds a user and a post, and then at the end of the test, I've got an after each or whatever that removes that user and presumably puts the database back to an empty state. But it's easy to mess that up, right? It's easy to insert 2 users and only delete 1 or something like that, right? And it's a pain in the ass to manage. Sometimes you have to delete some records before others, depending on how you set up your database and stuff. So just truncating everything and starting from zero, starting from empty, is a much more reliable way. It's aggressive. It may not be the right answer for all test suites, but it's a great place to start because you want to start from an empty database. Down the road, you may end up wanting to start with specific presets of how your database is. Just to speed things up or make things simpler, or just because sometimes you'll want to say like, okay, but these functions given database database fixture 1 versus database fixture 2, right? You may want to save some time doing something like that and predefining a non-null database set, but starting at empty is just an easy place to have reliable consistency before each test.
Do you think you have enough time to talk about spies, stubs, and mocks?
It's a whole other lecture, yeah. I'm happy to give that lecture. It was on the voting list.
Do you think you can talk just a little bit about like what? My main question is if you're not using sign-on, you're just like, let's say you didn't have access to that. Like, it seems like all it really is just a way of getting, I mean, almost like spies is like you consolize and you're getting more information. Stubs is like if you want to make your own stub, you'd just be making a function that takes the place of what one of the functions is doing. You know, you're just like, okay, this is going to take a lot of time, so I'm just going to make a function that does it for me within there. That's the basic idea of mocks and stubs. You're just like creating your own function instead of having to do the database call or whatever it is.
Yeah, mocks and stubs is a really big topic, but yeah, one version of a stub is just a different function that you give instead of, and you just assert about, and it keeps track of whether it was called or not and all that kind of stuff. So you can say like, this function should have been called 3 times or whatever. Cool. So does everyone think they can go add Postgres to their project, connect to a database, write some queries, and then write some tests to make sure those queries do what they're supposed to do?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did last week. I'm doing it this week.
Sweet. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Let's call it there.
No, I was saying I did last.